What would you do if the only thing you inherited from a lifetime of loss was a sound? Not a house, not a parcel of farmland, not even a pocket watch, but the deed to a waterfall, a ceaseless roar of water tumbling over a cliffside nobody wanted. For 18-year-old Iris May Calloway, this wasn't a question. It was the final, baffling postscript to her father's quiet, lonely life. The town of Fern Hollow called it a fool's inheritance, a cruel joke played on an orphan girl with nothing to her name but a threadbare coat and a stubborn old mule. But the truth waiting behind that curtain of mist and stone was a secret that would not only redefine the father she thought she knew, but the very meaning of what it is to own something. Settle in and let us know in the comments where you're watching from, as we tell the story of the girl who was left nothing but a waterfall and found everything, the air in Mr. Finch's law office was thick with the smell of old paper and beeswax, a scent that clung to the heavy silence in the room. Iris May Calloway sat on a stiff horsehair chair, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on a crack in the plaster. She was 18, but the last week had carved years into the lines around her eyes. Her father, Elias Calloway, had been buried 2 days prior in the small churchyard overlooking the valley, a simple pine box lowered into the rocky soil. Now came the final accounting of his life. Her 2 half-brothers, grown men with hard faces and her father's first wife's eyes, sat opposite her. They had never offered her a kind word, and they did not start now. Mr. Finch, a man whose face seemed permanently pinched with mild disapproval, cleared his throat and read from the will. To Jedediah and Caleb, he bequeathed the 40-acre homestead, the cabin, the barn, all livestock save one, the wagon, the tools, the traps, everything of practical value, everything that meant survival. A low grunt of satisfaction came from her brothers. Then, the lawyer turned his gaze to Iris May, and to my daughter, Iris May Calloway. He read, his voice devoid of emotion. I leave my sole remaining parcel, that which is known as Calloway Falls, and all the mist that rises from it. May she find in its voice the peace I never could. Silence. Jedediah snorted, a sharp, ugly sound. A patch of wet rocks and noise, fitting. Iris May didn't flinch. She felt a cold stillness settle over her, the familiar companion of grief. She had expected nothing, and this was somehow less than that. It was poetry, and poetry couldn't fill a stomach or mend a roof. After signing the papers, her knuckles white around the pen, she walked out into the pale mountain light. Her brother Caleb stopped her on the boardwalk. You'll be wanting to sell that foolishness, he said, not unkindly, but with the weary impatience of a man swatting a fly. Silas Croft might give you $10 for the timber rights, though there ain't much timber on it. She looked at him, at the face so like her father's but missing the deep-set sadness she knew so well. No, she said, her voice quiet but firm. I'll keep it. He just shook his head and walked away, leaving her alone on the dusty street with the deed in her pocket and her father's old gray mule, Gideon, tethered to the hitching post. The mule was the only other thing the will had granted her. Gideon blinked his long-lashed, knowing eyes and nudged her hand with his soft nose, as if to say, well, what now? The deed felt thin and brittle in her hands, a piece of paper that represented the sum of her worldly possessions, Calloway Falls. She'd seen it only a handful of times as a child, a landmark on the far edge of their trapping lines. To everyone in Fern Hollow, it was just that, a landmark, a place where the creek took a sudden dive off the Black Ridge, a spectacle of white water and spray that was pretty to look at but utterly useless. The land was a steep, rocky gorge, impossible to farm, treacherous to log. The water itself ran too fast and shallow for a mill. It was, as her brother had so bluntly put it, a view. and a view was a luxury for people who had a window to look out of. Iris May had no window. She had a canvas roll with a blanket and a spare shirt, a small sack of flour, and the mule, Gideon, who now carried it all. Her father's cabin, the only home she'd ever known, was no longer hers. Jedediah's wife had made that clear before the dirt on the grave had even settled. She spent a night in the livery stable, the owner taking pity on her and allowing her the use of an empty stall in exchange for a few hours of mucking out. The smell of hay and horse was more comforting than the cloying scent of Mr. Finch's office. The next morning, under a sky the color of slate, she decided there was only one place to go. If she owned the falls, then she would go to them. Leading Gideon by his rope, she walked out of Fern Hollow, her back to the whispers and the pitying glances. The trail to the falls was little more than a game path, winding up through dense stands of pine and hemlock. The air grew cooler, damper, and the sound began long before the sight. A low, distant rumble that grew into a steady, percussive roar. It was the sound of something immense and eternal, a sound that had been here long before the town of Fern Hollow, and would be here long after. She and Gideon emerged from the trees onto a rocky outcrop, and there it was, a sheet of water at least 100 feet high, crashing down into a deep, stone-lined pool. The mist, just as the will had said, rose in a constant, shimmering cloud, coating every rock and leaf with a slick sheen of moisture. It was beautiful, fiercely so, and it was utterly desolate. The ground was a jumble of moss-covered boulders and thin, acidic soil where only ferns and hardy weeds could grow. There was no flat piece of earth to pitch a tent, no pasture for Gideon, no hope of a garden. It was exactly as worthless as everyone had said. She slid the pack from Gideon's back and sank onto a cold, damp rock, the roar of the water filling her ears, her head, her whole being. It felt like the physical embodiment of her own crushing loss. What was she supposed to do with this? How could a father leave his only daughter a legacy of rushing water and cold stone? Was it a final bitter joke? Or was there something hidden in the roar that only she was meant to hear? Let us know what you think he intended in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of hidden truths and quiet triumphs. Now, let's get back to Iris May, as the town began to take notice of the girl who lived by the waterfall. News traveled fast in a place like Fern Hollow, carried on the currents of gossip that flowed from the general store to the saloon to the church steps. The story of Iris May Calloway and her peculiar inheritance became a source of amusement, a bit of local folklore in the making. Men at the saloon would laugh over their beers. Heard Elias Calloway left that girl of his the prettiest piece of useless land in the county, one would say. Gave her the deed to a waterfall. The laughter that followed was loud and dismissive. Silas Croft, a man whose ambition was as sharp as his tailored city coat, found it particularly funny. Croft was buying up parcels all over the valley, consolidating small homesteads into a larger tract for a timber operation he planned to bring in from the east. He saw Iris May outside the general store, loading a small bag of oats onto Gideon's back. He tipped his hat with a theatrical flourish, his smile thin and predatory. "Miss Calloway," he said, his voice loud enough for others on the boardwalk to hear. "I hear congratulations are in order. You're a landowner." Iris May said nothing, just cinched the rope on the sack. "A fine piece of property," he continued, undeterred by her silence. "All that atmosphere." He waved a hand vaguely in the direction of the mountains. "Tell you what, I feel for your situation. I'll give you $20 for it. Cash. Take the burden right off your young shoulders." The offer was an insult, wrapped in false pity. $20 was less than the value of the mule standing beside her. She looked at him, her gaze level and clear. "It's not for sale, Mr. Croft." His smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "Don't be a fool, girl. It's rocks and water. What use could you possibly have for it?" "It was my father's," she said simply. And that was the end of it. She led Gideon away, leaving Croft staring after her, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. Later that day, as she passed the small cottages on the edge of town, she saw old Elspeth Reed sitting on her porch, her hands busy with a piece of knitting, her eyes watching everything. Elspeth was the town's oldest resident, a woman who seemed woven from the mist and memory of the mountains themselves. As Iris May passed, the old woman's knitting needles stilled. Her voice, when it came, was dry and rustling like autumn leaves. "Some men build walls to keep the world out," Elspeth said, not looking at Iris, but out toward the ridge. "Your father, he built with water to let the right one in." The words made no sense. They hung in the air between them, heavy with a meaning Iris May couldn't grasp. She nodded a polite acknowledgement and continued on her way, the strange sentence echoing in her mind. What door could be made of water? And who was the right one meant to enter it? The cryptic warning or blessing, she wasn't sure which, settled in her heart like a smooth, heavy stone. With the $20 from the sale of a few of her mother's silver buttons, Iris May bought a small canvas tent, a cooking pot, and a bag of beans. There was no other choice but to make a life on the land she had been given. She and Gideon made the trek back to the falls, this time with a sense of grim purpose. She found the most level spot she could, a small patch of earth nestled between three great boulders, partially sheltered from the ceaseless mist. It was damp, but it was hers. The first few days were a study in misery. A persistent drizzle kept everything perpetually wet. Her small fires sputtered and smoked, struggling to combat the dampness that seeped into her clothes, her blanket, her very bones. The roar of the waterfall was a constant, oppressive presence. It wasn't a peaceful sound. It was a physical force, a vibration that worked its way through the soles of her worn boots and up into her teeth. At night, it filled her dreams, a chaotic noise that left no room for peace. Gideon seemed to feel it too. The mule was listless, standing with his head low, his long ears drooping. She spent her days gathering firewood, foraging for edible greens along the creek bed, and trying to create some semblance of order in her small, wet world. She built a small rock wall to divert the worst of the spray from her tent and cleared a patch of ferns to make a path to the pool at the base of the falls. It was hard, lonely work. The sun rarely broke through the canopy of trees, and when it did, the light was splintered and pale, filtered through the ever-present mist. The place felt ancient and indifferent, a corner of the world that had no need for humans and offered them no comfort. One evening, as dusk settled like a gray blanket over the gorge, she sat huddled by her struggling fire, eating a small bowl of beans. The loneliness was a physical ache in her chest. She looked at the waterfall, its white torrent turning a ghostly silver in the fading light. It was a wall, a beautiful, powerful, impassable wall of water that separated her from the rest of the world. She felt a surge of despair, a feeling so sharp it stole her breath. This wasn't a home. It was a prison made of sound and spray. As she drifted into an uneasy sleep that night, the sound of the falls seemed to change. Or perhaps she was just starting to listen differently. Beneath the constant deafening crash, she thought she could hear something else. A hollow note, an echo that didn't belong. It was a subtle resonance, like the sound of a drum hidden deep within the orchestra of the water. Days bled into a week, then two. A routine, stark and simple, began to form. Wake at dawn, tend the fire, fetch water, check her snares, forage. The work was demanding, but it kept the worst of the despair at bay. Her hands, once soft, were now calloused and stained with dirt and berry juice. She grew leaner, tougher, her movements economical and sure. She was becoming part of the place, shaped by its harsh beauty just as the water shaped the stone. And she kept listening. The hollow echo was real. It was most noticeable in the late afternoon, when the wind died down and the air grew still. It seemed to emanate from a specific point behind the main cascade of water, slightly to the north. Gideon noticed it too. The old mule, who had been so dejected, began to spend his days standing on a flat ledge of rock near the pool, his gaze fixed on the spot where the water fell thickest. His ears would swivel, alert and focused, tracking a sound only he could fully discern. He would stand there for hours, patient and watchful, ignoring the sweet patches of clover she found for him further up the trail. His strange vigil was the first real clue. Animals knew things people forgot. One afternoon, while sitting on a rock sketching the patterns of moss on the cliff face with a piece of charcoal, a habit learned from her father, she saw it. The moss wasn't random. On the sheer rock wall beside the falls, a faint, almost invisible line of darker, greener moss snaked its way upward, toward the very place Gideon always watched. It looked less like a natural growth and more like a path, a trail worn by something other than time. That's when a memory surfaced, sharp and clear. She was a little girl, sitting on her father's lap by the fire. He was carving a small wooden bird, the shavings falling like snow onto the hearth. "The best doors don't have hinges, Iris May," he had murmured, his voice raspy from a winter cough. "The best doors are the ones you have to learn to see." A door without hinges, a path made of moss, a hollow sound behind a wall of water. The pieces clicked into place with a sudden heart-stopping clarity. The thought was so wild, so impossible, that she almost dismissed it. But her father had not been a simple man. He was quiet, yes, and poor, but his mind had always worked in strange and winding ways. He had left her the falls for a reason, and she was beginning to suspect that the reason was not in front of the water, but behind it. A thrill, half fear and half hope shot through her. The challenge was no longer just to survive, but to understand. Her decision was made. She would go behind the water. The first step was preparation. The rock face was slick with algae and mist, a treacherous vertical surface. To even approach the ledge behind the cascade, she needed a safer path. For 2 days she labored, her world shrinking to the task at hand. She used Gideon to drag a long, fallen pine log to the edge of the pool. It was heavy, unwieldy work, and the mule grunted in protest, but he seemed to understand the importance of the task, pulling with a strength she hadn't seen in him for months. With her father's small, sharp hand axe, she painstakingly chopped deep notches into the top of the log, creating a crude but serviceable bridge that spanned the most dangerous, slippery section of rocks at the water's edge. Her arms ached, her back screamed, but with every swing of the axe, a sense of purpose grew within her. This was her father's language, the language of wood and stone and patient effort. She was speaking it now, answering a question he had posed long ago. Next, she gathered the longest, sturdiest rope she had. Tying one end around her waist and the other securely to the base of a thick, deep-rooted cedar, she began her ascent. The mossy path was even more precarious up close. It offered little in the way of handholds. She moved slowly, testing every crevice before trusting it with her weight. The spray from the waterfall soaked her within seconds, plastering her hair to her face and chilling her to the bone. The roar was immense, a physical blow that vibrated through her skull, making it impossible to think. She could only feel and move and breathe. Inch by painstaking inch, she climbed toward the spot. Finally, her fingers closed around a firm, dry edge of rock. She had reached a ledge, hidden behind the thundering sheet of water. She pulled herself up onto it, her body trembling with cold and exertion. The ledge was about 3 feet wide, a natural shelf in the rock face, but it had been widened and flattened by hand. She could see the tool marks in the stone. It was a deliberate space, and it led to a dark opening in the cliff, a blackness deeper than shadow. The air flowing out of it was cool, dry, and smelled faintly of wood smoke and pine. She stood there for a long moment, catching her breath, the water falling in a deafening silver curtain just inches from her face. She was in a space between worlds, hidden from sight, standing on the threshold of her father's greatest secret. The open loop of his life was about to be closed. With a deep breath, she untied the rope from her waist and took the first step into the darkness. She fumbled in her oilskin pouch, her fingers numb with cold, until they found the tin of matches and the small lantern. The match scraped, flared, and for a moment she saw only her own shaking hand. Then she touched the flame to the lantern's wick, and a warm, golden light pushed back the gloom. She raised it high and gasped. It was not a cave. It was a cabin. A small, perfect room carved from the heart of the mountain. The back and side walls were the living, unhewn rock of the cliff, but the front wall, facing the waterfall, was a masterful construction of river stone and fitted timbers, so expertly camouflaged it would be invisible from the outside. A small, clever chimney was vented up through a natural fissure in the rock. The floor was made of thick, smooth sawn planks. The space was no bigger than a trapper's line shack, but it felt like a cathedral. The air was still and dry, a sanctuary from the damp world outside. A simple cot with a neatly folded wool blanket sat against one wall. A small cast-iron stove stood in the corner, a stack of split firewood beside it. There was a sturdy wooden table and a single chair. But it was the other wall that held her transfixed. It was covered, from floor to ceiling, with shelves, and the shelves were not filled with traps or tools or supplies for survival. They were filled with books, journals bound in leather, tins neatly labeled with the names of seeds, glass jars holding preserved butterflies and beetles, and dozens of wooden boxes containing meticulously organized collections of rocks, feathers, and pressed flowers. This was not the shelter of Elias Calloway, the grim, silent trapper. This was the study of a scholar, a naturalist, an artist. On the table, a single large ledger lay open. Iris May approached it as if it were a sacred text. She ran her fingers over the worn leather cover. Inside, the pages were filled not with numbers, but with her father's elegant, precise script and drawings, stunningly detailed sketches in ink and charcoal, the intricate pattern of a hawk's wing, the delicate veins on a maple leaf, the anatomy of a trout. He had been documenting the entire valley, from the smallest insect to the grandest peak. Tucked inside the front cover was a sealed envelope. On it, in that same familiar hand, were 2 words, "For Iris May." Her fingers trembled as she broke the seal. The letter inside was short. "My daughter," it began. "If you are reading this, you listened. I knew you would. The world saw a trapper, and I let them. It was easier. But this place, this is the truth of me. All I ever learned, all I ever saw, it's here. It was never about owning the land. It was about knowing it. This is your inheritance. Not the water, but what the water protects." She sank into the chair, the letter clutched in her hand, and wept. Not from grief, but from a profound, earth-shattering sense of discovery. She had not been left with nothing. She had been left with everything. The discovery of the cabin changed everything. It was not just a shelter. It was a home, imbued with the spirit of the father she was only now beginning to know. She spent the next weeks exploring its secrets, reading his journals, learning the names he had given to every hidden spring and rare wildflower in the valley. She moved her few belongings inside, and for the first time since his death, she felt a sense of peace. The roar of the waterfall was no longer a torment. It was a lullaby, the sound of her guardian, her door. But the mountain was not done testing her. In late autumn, the sky turned a bruised purple-gray, and a storm of legendary fury descended upon Fern Hollow. The wind howled through the gorge like a hungry animal, and the rain came down in solid, blinding sheets. The creek swelled, and the waterfall transformed from a graceful curtain into a raging, violent torrent. The sound was apocalyptic, a physical assault that shook the very rock around her. The cabin, tucked behind the deluge, was safe and dry, but Iris May's heart was tight with fear for Gideon. She had moved him to a deep, sheltered overhang further down the path, but she worried the rising water might reach him. For 2 days the storm raged without ceasing. The world outside her hidden sanctuary was a churning chaos of wind and water. On the 3rd day, during a brief lull when the rain eased to a steady downpour, she heard it. A faint cry, nearly lost in the thunder of the falls. At first she thought it was the wind, but then it came again, sharper this time, desperate. A human voice. Peering through a cleverly designed peephole her father had drilled through the stone wall, she saw them. A woman and a small boy, huddled at the base of the cliff on the opposite side of the now impassable creek. A wrecked wagon lay on its side nearby, one wheel spinning uselessly in the wind. They were soaked, shivering, and trapped. Without a second thought, Iris May grabbed a coil of rope and her warmest blanket. She fought her way through the curtain of water, back out onto the treacherous ledge. Bracing herself against the rock, she yelled, her voice raw, "Over here!" The woman looked up, her face etched with terror and relief. Following Iris May's shouted instructions, the woman tied the rope around her son, and then herself. With all her strength, Iris May pulled them one by one across the churning water to the relative safety of the rocks on her side, and then guided them along the mossy path, behind the waterfall, and into the warm, dry cabin. The woman, whose name was Sarah Weber, stared around in disbelief, her son clinging to her skirts. "It's a miracle," she whispered, her teeth chattering. Iris May stirred the embers in the stove and added fresh wood. "No," she said, handing the woman a warm, dry blanket. "It's just a home." The storm finally broke on the 5th day. The sun emerged pale and watery to illuminate a world washed clean and battered. As soon as the creek subsided enough to be crossed, Sarah Weber's husband, who had been searching frantically for his family, found his way to the falls, led by his wife's shouts. His relief upon finding them safe and warm in the impossible cabin was overwhelming. When the Webers returned to Fern Hollow, their story spread like wildfire. They spoke of the trapper's strange daughter, not as a fool, but as a hero. They described a secret home hidden behind the water, a place of warmth and scholarship, filled with books and maps and wonders. The tale was too fantastic to be ignored. A few days later, a small procession of townspeople made their way up the trail to Callaway Falls, led by a curious and skeptical Silas Croft. He still believed it was a tall tale, some trick of the light or a flight of fancy from a terrified woman. Iris May met them at the entrance to the gorge. She said nothing, simply led them along the path she had cleared, over the log bridge, and onto the ledge. One by one they stepped behind the curtain of water and into the cabin. A collective gasp went through the small crowd. They stood in stunned silence, looking at the shelves, the drawings, the neat stacks of journals. They saw not the squalor of a hermit, but the ordered, beautiful world of a genius. Silas Croft's face was a mask of disbelief. He ran a hand over a smooth, carved bird, then picked up a journal, his eyes scanning the detailed drawings of plant root systems. He saw value here, but it was a value he couldn't measure in board feet or dollar bills. He had mocked her for inheriting a view, and she had inherited a universe. The town clerk, Mr. Abernathy, had come with them, bringing his surveying tools and the official town maps. He spent an hour taking measurements, his brow furrowed in concentration. Finally, he straightened up and looked at Iris May, a look of profound respect in his eyes. "It's all here, clear as day," he announced to the assembled group. "The deed specifies the falls and the land 50 feet from its source on all sides. This cabin, it's well within the legal boundaries. Your father, Miss Calloway," he said, his voice carrying a new weight, "deeded you a home, a most extraordinary home." The whispers of the townspeople were no longer of mockery, but of awe. The girl with the fool's inheritance had become the keeper of the valley's soul. A quiet season of grace settled over the gorge. The town, having seen the truth of Elias Calloway's legacy, rewrote its memory of him. He was no longer just a poor, solitary trapper, but the secret guardian of the valley, its quiet observer. And Iris May was his heir, not just to his property, but to his purpose. People began to make the trek to the falls, not out of idle curiosity, but with a kind of reverence. They brought her things, a sack of potatoes from one farmer, a jar of preserved peaches from another's wife, a set of new leather straps for Gideon's harness from the blacksmith. They were small offerings of apology and respect. Silas Croft never made another offer on the land. He was seen once more, standing on the opposite side of the creek, just looking at the falls, a strange, contemplative expression on his face. He tipped his hat to Iris May, a gesture no longer mocking but deferential, and then turned and walked away. A young farmer named Thomas Gable, whose land bordered the Calloway parcel, became a quiet, steady presence. He helped her build a small, sturdy paddock for Gideon in a sheltered clearing, and showed her how to clear a small patch of land for a garden, explaining how his own father had learned to work the thin mountain soil. He never overstayed his welcome, speaking little, but his help was practical and his presence comforting. One evening, in the golden hour when the sun slanted through the pines and turned the waterfall's mist into a veil of liquid gold, Iris May sat at her father's desk. The lantern cast a warm glow on the open page of his journal. She was tracing the delicate lines of a drawing he had made of a rare mountain orchid, one he had found blooming in a single hidden cleft of rock high on the black ridge. Thomas had brought a small sack of flour and a few late-season apples, and now stood beside her, looking over her shoulder at a large, intricate map of the valley spread across the table. It was a masterpiece of cartography, showing every stream, every game trail, every ancient stand of trees. "He knew this place," Thomas said softly, his voice full of wonder. "He knew it better than anyone." Iris May looked from the map to the drawing of the flower, and then out through the shimmering curtain of water at the world beyond. A profound understanding settled over her, the final piece of her inheritance clicking into place. "He didn't own the land," she said, her voice quiet and sure. "He just paid attention to it." She was home, truly home, surrounded not by walls of wood and stone, but by a legacy of quiet observation and deep, abiding love. Thank you for staying with us for this story of discovery and the quiet power of looking closer. If you were moved by Iris May's journey, please give this video a like and share it with someone who appreciates a story with heart. Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell so you won't miss our next tale. We'll be telling the story of an old fisherman who buys a wrecked boat for $1, only to find a secret hidden in its hull that will change his town forever. Until then, be well, and remember to look for the beauty hidden in plain sight.